Tamsin Karaith had not planned to spend her Thursday afternoon sinking into the earth like a fence post. And yet, here she was, buried to mid-thigh in the thick black mud of Ashenmere Creek, one boot gone, the other filling steadily with ice-cold water, and her dignity somewhere downstream. She had been checking the overflow channels. That was all. A routine survey after 3 days of heavy rain, the kind of task nobody noticed unless it went undone, at which point the lower fields flooded and suddenly everyone had opinions about the riverkeeper. The eastern bank had collapsed where the old birch roots had finally given up their hold, and she had climbed down to assess the damage, and the ground had simply swallowed her. That had been an hour ago. She had tried pulling herself free. She had tried twisting. She had tried reasoning with the mud, which had not worked, and threatening the mud, which had worked slightly less. She had grabbed a root with both hands and hauled until her arms burned and the root snapped, and she sat back into the muck with a sound that was deeply, profoundly undignified. Now she was just sitting in it, half submerged in creek mud, soaked to the waist, hair falling out of its braid and plastered to her neck with sweat and silt. Talking to herself because there was no one else to talk to, and she had to talk to someone or she would scream. "This is fine," she muttered, wiping a streak of mud from her cheek and succeeding only in spreading it further. "This is completely fine. You are a competent woman with a respectable trade, and you are going to die in a ditch." A bird landed on the collapsed bank above her and tilted its head. "Don't," Tamsin warned it. The bird regarded her with obvious judgment and flew away. She was so focused on her predicament that she didn't hear the horse, didn't register the soft thud of hooves on wet grass or the creak of leather as the rider dismounted. The first thing she heard was silence, the specific, weighted silence of someone watching her. Tamsin looked up. A man stood at the top of the bank, tall enough that the pale afternoon light framed him like a painting she couldn't afford. Broad-shouldered in a way that suggested the world generally rearranged itself around him rather than the other way around. Dark hair pushed back from a face that was all sharp angles and hard lines, a face designed for severity that had never once been asked to soften. He was staring at her, not with amusement, not with concern, not with any expression she could name. He was staring at her the way a man stared at something impossible. His lips were parted slightly. His hands, which had been at his sides, had curled into fists, and his chest was rising and falling in deep, uneven pulls like he had just surfaced from underwater. Tamsin stared back, mud dripping from her elbow, and felt the precise moment her brain caught up with her eyes, the crest on his riding jacket, the black and silver of House Voss, the signet ring on his left hand that she had seen stamped on every official document that crossed the riverkeeper's office. That was the king. That was Calder Voss, Alpha King of Dunvarin, standing 6 feet above her on a creek bank, watching her marinate in mud like a root vegetable. "Your Majesty," Tamsin said, because her mouth apparently had no survival instinct whatsoever. "I can explain." He didn't respond. He didn't move. His eyes, pale gray and unnervingly focused, stayed locked on her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle despite the cold water seeping through her clothes. His expression wasn't cruel or mocking, but shaken, like he had been struck from the inside by a force he hadn't expected. "I'm the riverkeeper," she continued, filling the silence because silence with a king felt significantly more dangerous than talking. "The bank collapsed. I was checking the overflow channels. I'm stuck. Obviously. I've been stuck for a while. I would very much like to not be stuck anymore." The king descended the bank in 2 strides, his boots hitting the water without hesitation, and waded toward her until he was standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face. The creek rose to his calves. He didn't seem to notice. He was breathing strangely, deep and ragged, like a man inhaling for the first time in months. His pupils were blown wide despite the daylight, and his hands were trembling at his sides, not from cold, from a force she couldn't identify. He was looking at her like she was air, and he had been drowning. "Your Majesty?" Tamsin whispered. His jaw tightened. A muscle worked beneath the skin. He reached down and gripped her arm just above the elbow, and the moment his hand closed around her, he made a sound low in his throat. Involuntary. Almost pained. His grip tightened and his eyes squeezed shut, and he stood there, knee-deep in creek water, holding onto her arm like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Tamsin felt a vibration move through her. Not physical, not exactly. A resonance beneath her ribs, deep and reverberant, like a bell struck in a room she didn't know existed. It lasted only a second, and then it was gone. "Are you all right?" she asked. He opened his eyes. They were sharper now, clearer, and when they found hers, a shift had occurred behind them, a presence that hadn't been there a moment ago. He pulled her free in one motion, just gripped and lifted like the mud was nothing, like she weighed nothing, and set her on the bank above him with a gentleness that didn't match the wild, unguarded look still burning in his face. Tamsin stood on solid ground, dripping, shaking, missing a boot, and utterly bewildered. The king climbed the bank after her. His breathing had steadied, but his gaze hadn't left her face. Hooves thundered up the path. A rider reined in hard, a lean man with a close-cropped beard, and the focused expression of someone who spent most of his life chasing a king who didn't want to be followed. "Sire," the rider said, slightly winded. "You left without Theron." The king's voice cut through the air like a blade, low, controlled, and vibrating with barely contained urgency. "Find Vedra. Tell her I need to see her tonight." Theron's gaze shifted to Tamsin, covered in mud and clutching her remaining boot, and then back to the king. His expression flickered with a recognition she couldn't read. "And tell no one about this," Calder added. The king turned back to Tamsin. His gray eyes held hers for one long, unreadable moment. "You're coming with me," he said. The room they put her in was small, clean, and windowless. Servants' quarters adjacent to the upper corridors, a room given to people the palace didn't quite know what to do with. Someone had left a basin of warm water, a folded towel, and a dress that was slightly too large across the shoulders, but significantly better than what she'd arrived in. Tamsin washed the mud from her arms and face and tried not to think about what had just happened. She thought about it anyway. The Alpha King of Dunveren had personally waded into a creek, looked at her like she'd rearranged the order of the universe, pulled her from the mud with one hand, and brought her to his palace without a single word of explanation. She kept replaying the moment his hand had closed around her arm, the sound he'd made, the way his entire body had reacted as if she'd given him an electric shock, the trembling in his hands that had nothing to do with cold. The way his eyes had sharpened, cleared, come alive. None of it made any sense. The dress was plain gray linen, serviceable, the sort of thing a kitchen girl might wear on a day she wanted to look respectable. Tamsin put it on and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the wall. She tried to form a plan. She did not form a plan. Her reflection in the wash basin showed a woman who looked exactly how she felt. Confused. Underdressed, and still carrying traces of creek silt behind her ears no matter how hard she scrubbed. She was a riverkeeper. She maintained waterways, filed survey reports, and argued with the steward's office about drainage budgets. She did not get summoned to palaces by kings who trembled when they touched her. The knock came 40 minutes later. Theron stood in the corridor, his posture military straight, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Coraith," he said. "The king would like you to join him in his study." "Why?" Tamsin asked. The question came out higher than she intended. "That's not for me to say. Is he angry? Did I do something wrong? Because I promise the creek is part of my jurisdiction. I'm authorized to be there. I have documentation." "He's not angry," Theron said. in a tone that shut the door on further questions. The walk through the upper corridors felt endless. Tamsin's borrowed shoes clicked against stone floors she had never walked on before. Past portraits of Voss kings whose painted eyes seemed to track her progress with mild aristocratic suspicion. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She was going to see the king, in his private study, wearing borrowed clothes and residual creek smell and absolutely zero understanding of what was happening. Theron stopped at a heavy door and knocked once, opened it without waiting for a reply. The king's study was larger than her entire cottage. Bookshelves lined every wall, climbing to a ceiling lost in shadow. A fire burned low in the grate. Maps covered the broad oak desk, their edges pinned down with weighted markers, and behind the desk sat Calder Voss, with a pen in his hand and a look on his face that suggested he had been trying very hard to concentrate on his work and failing. He looked up when she entered. His pen stilled, and there it was again. That expression. The shaken, almost bewildered look that had no business being on the face of a man who had won a war and held a kingdom together with his bare hands. It lasted only a second before he controlled it, pulling it behind a mask of composure she suspected he wore like armor, but she saw it. She was beginning to recognize it. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair along the far wall. Tamsin sat. The chair was stiff and uncomfortable, positioned too far from the fire to benefit from its warmth, but close enough to the king's desk that she could see the tendons in his forearm flex as he wrote. She sat. He worked. Neither spoke. Minutes crawled past. 5, 10, 15. Tamsin folded her hands in her lap, then unfolded them, then folded them again. She counted the books on the nearest shelf. She studied the map pinned above the fireplace. She tried very hard not to stare at the king and failed intermittently. A shift was happening in him. She couldn't name it, but she could see it if she watched closely. The rigid set of his shoulders loosened incrementally, like a coiled spring releasing one turn at a time. His pen moved more fluidly. His head tilted slightly, tracking a sound from the corridor outside, a servant's footsteps that Tamsin could barely hear. He reacted to it with the easy alertness of an animal whose senses were fully engaged. The change was gradual, but undeniable. By the time an hour had passed, the king's posture had transformed. He sat straighter, moved more easily, breathed more deeply. The hollowed-out quality she had glimpsed at the creek, the grayness beneath his skin, had receded. Color had returned to his face. His pen moved with precision rather than effort. He was better. Measurably, visibly better. And all she had done was sit in a chair. "You can go," he said, without looking up. Tamsin stood, her legs stiff from the uncomfortable chair, and left without a word because she had no words to offer. Theron was in the corridor immediately, falling into step beside her. "How long were you in there?" he asked. "An hour. Maybe a bit more." "And did you notice anything?" Tamsin frowned. He kept clenching his jaw. "I think he's upset about the situation." Theron's stride didn't break, but a flicker crossed his expression. Behind the professional calm, it looked uncomfortably like hope. "He's not upset," Theron said. They walked in silence for several paces. Tamsin's mind churned through possibilities, each one more confusing than the last. The king had pulled her from a creek, brought her to the palace, made her sit in a chair for an hour while he worked. And now his second-in-command was asking questions like she'd performed surgery instead of gathering splinters in her palms from a wooden armrest. "The king has requested you return tomorrow," Theron said, stopping at the door to her borrowed room. "And the day after, until further notice." Tamsin's stomach dropped. "Until further notice? Why? What did I do?" Theron's hand rested on the door frame. He hesitated, and in that hesitation she saw the careful calculation of a man deciding how much truth to give a stranger. Because you're the only thing keeping him alive, he said. The words hung in the corridor like smoke. By the time Tamsin opened her mouth to respond, Theron was already gone. The arrangement began the following afternoon and immediately established itself as the strangest experience of Tamsin's life, and she had once pulled a live otter out of a grain silo. The rules were simple. Theron delivered them without ceremony each morning. Arrive at the king's study by the third afternoon bell. Sit in the designated chair. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not touch anything on the desk. Do not tell anyone about the arrangement. Tamsin was terrible at all of these things. On the first day, she managed 12 minutes of silence before the quiet became physically unbearable, and she said, "Your map of the northern tributaries is wrong." The king's pen stopped. His gaze lifted. The full weight of the Alpha King's attention landed on her like a boulder. "Excuse me?" he said. "The copper vein branch." She pointed at the map above the fireplace. "It doesn't fork at Greymarch. It forks 2 miles south of Greymarch, past the mill ruins. Whoever drew that has never actually walked the waterway." A silence followed that felt approximately 3 centuries long. "And you have," the king said. "I walk it every spring to clear the ice jams," Tamsin replied. "The fork floods the barley fields if it's not maintained." Another silence. His expression was unreadable. Tamsin's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. Then he said, "Show me," and pushed the map across the desk. She spent 20 minutes correcting the northern waterways while the king watched her hands trace the accurate paths with a focus that made her skin warm. When she looked up, his gray eyes were not on the map. She went back to her chair. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Less like a wall, and more like a held breath. By the third day, she had abandoned all pretense of quiet. She brought a stack of river survey reports to work through while she sat, and the sound of her turning pages apparently offended the king's sense of order because he asked, "Must you do that so aggressively?" "Do what?" "Turn pages. You turn pages like you're punishing the paper." "I didn't realize there was a royal standard for page turning, Your Majesty." The corner of his mouth twitched. It was gone immediately, buried beneath the severity, but she saw it and it made warmth bloom beneath her sternum. On the fourth afternoon, she arrived to find a small table beside her chair that hadn't been there before, a proper surface for her reports, with an inkwell and a pen that was significantly nicer than anything she owned. The king offered no explanation. He didn't even look up when she entered. But the table was there, and it was positioned at exactly the right height, and Tamsin pressed her lips together very hard to keep from smiling. She started noticing things. Small details that didn't make sense individually, but formed a troubling pattern when she laid them side by side. The king squinted at documents he held at arm's length, as if the text blurred before him. When guards changed shifts outside the study door, the metallic clank of armor didn't register on his face, but when Tamsin was sitting close, his head would turn at the faintest rustle from the corridor. His movements carried a careful, measured quality, the deliberate precision of a man compensating for senses he couldn't fully trust. On the 5th day, she dropped her ink bottle. It slipped from the edge of her new table, and time seemed to slow. She watched it fall. Watched the king's hand shoot out from behind the desk with a speed that didn't belong to a man sitting 8 feet away. His fingers closed around the bottle an inch above the floor. They both froze. He was leaning halfway across the desk, arm extended, the bottle caught in a grip that trembled faintly. His eyes were wide, not with the casual reflex of someone who'd always been fast, but with the shock of someone who hadn't been able to do that in a very long time. He set the bottle down without a word. His hand was still shaking. "Thank you," Tamsin said carefully. He nodded once, curtly, and went back to his correspondence. But she watched him flex his fingers beneath the desk, testing the grip, the responsiveness, the speed that had briefly returned. And the expression that crossed his face, unguarded and heartbreakingly grateful, stayed with her for the rest of the day. The guards talked when they thought she couldn't hear. She caught fragments on her walks through the corridors, pieces of a picture she wasn't meant to see. The king was worse on days she arrived late. His temper shortened. His reactions slowed. One afternoon, she had been delayed by a collapsed culvert near the south wall and arrived 30 minutes past the third bell. The guard who escorted her walked faster than usual. Inside the study, the king stood with his palms flat on the windowsill, his head bowed, his breathing controlled in that deliberate way people breathed when they were trying not to fall apart. "Your Majesty?" Tamsin said from the doorway. He turned to her. The color of his eyes was wrong, flat, dull, the luminous gray faded to ash. The predatory focus that lived behind them, the wolf that she had glimpsed in flashes and half-moments, was absent. His gaze held all the sharpness of fog. "I can't hear them anymore," he said. His voice came out cracked, stripped of authority, stripped of everything except exhaustion. "My guards outside the door, their heartbeats. I could hear them this morning, and now I can't." Tamsin stepped fully into the room. She didn't go to the chair. She moved toward him, pulled by an instinct she couldn't name, and stopped 2 feet away. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. His jaw tightened. The muscle jumped. He turned back to the window. "Your Majesty," Tamsin repeated, firmer now. "How long?" "Over a year," he said to the glass. The words landed like stones. Over a year. Whatever was wrong with him, whatever she'd been unknowingly holding at bay by sitting in an uncomfortable chair and turning pages aggressively, had been eating him alive for over a year, and she was the only thing slowing it down. Mistress Vedra's workroom smelled of dried rosemary and candle wax and the particular sharp-edged calm of a woman who had seen too much to be startled by anything. She was older than Tamsin had expected, silver-haired and straight-backed, with hands that moved among her bottles and jars with the unconscious precision of someone who could mix a tincture in her sleep. "Sit," Vedra said, not looking up from the compound she was measuring. Tamsin sat on the wooden stool by the workbench and waited while the healer finished her task, capped the jar, wiped her hands on a cloth, and finally turned to face her with eyes that were uncomfortably sharp. "Theron tells me you're the Riverkeeper," Vedra said. "Yes." "And you've been sitting in the king's study every afternoon for 5 days." "Yes." "And you have no idea why." Tamsin opened her mouth, then closed it. "I have theories," she managed. "None of them make sense." Vedra studied her for a long moment, a measuring look that made Tamsin feel like she was being read from the inside out. Then the healer pulled a second stool from beneath the workbench and sat across from her, close enough that their knees nearly touched. "What I am about to tell you is known to 4 people in this kingdom," Vedra said. "Theron, myself, the king, and now you. If it reaches a 5th, I will know exactly where it came from." Tamsin's mouth went dry. "Understood." "The king's wolf is dying." The words landed like a physical blow. Tamsin gripped the edge of the stool, her knuckles going white. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It is happening nonetheless," Vedra replied, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a grief she had clearly been carrying for some time. "Since the Grey Peak campaign, over a year ago, his wolf has been fading, retreating deeper inside him. His senses are going first, hearing, sight, scent, all dulling toward human baseline. His reflexes are slowing. His ability to shift has been compromised for months." Tamsin stared at her. "The Alpha King can't shift?" "He hasn't shifted in 9 months," Vedra said. "He doesn't dare try. If the shift fails halfway, it will kill him." The room seemed to contract around Tamsin, the walls pressing inward, the air thinning. "You said his wolf is dying. Can a wolf die without killing the man?" Vedra finished. "No. An alpha's wolf is not separate from the alpha. It is his heart, his instinct, his anchor. When it goes, he goes. How long does he have? Vedra's pause was answer enough, but she said it anyway. Months, maybe less. The deterioration has been accelerating. Tamsin pressed her palms against her thighs to stop them from shaking. And me? Why does sitting in a chair help? Vedra leaned forward slightly. That is precisely what I'm trying to understand. When you are near him, the decline reverses. His senses sharpen, his reflexes return. Theron reports that after your sessions, the king can hear conversations through walls again, can track movement across a crowded room. His wolf surfaces. She paused. It is, frankly, impossible. Why impossible? Because you are wolfless, child. The word landed like it always did. A small, precise wound in a place that had been cut so many times the scar tissue was thick enough to ignore. Almost. I'm aware, Tamsin said flatly. Vedra's expression softened a fraction. I don't say it as a judgment. I say it as a medical fact. You carry no active wolf signature, no pheromonal markers. You should have no effect on a dying alpha's wolf whatsoever, and yet you do. Which means we are dealing with forces I haven't seen before. So you don't know why this is happening? Not yet. Tamsin exhaled slowly. What do you need from me? More time, more proximity. Vedra rose and crossed to her shelves, pulling down a leather-bound journal she had clearly been filling with notes. The afternoon sessions are helping, but the effect fades once you leave. The decline resumes within hours. I need to understand whether sustained exposure extends the reversal. Tamsin saw where this was going. You want me to spend more time with him. I want you to spend your evenings in his chambers. Tamsin's face went hot. In his... I can't just... In a chair by the fire, Vedra clarified, one eyebrow rising. Not in his bed. Child. You'll sit. He'll work. The same arrangement, extended into the evening hours. I need to know if longer exposure builds a lasting effect or merely delays the inevitable. The heat in Tamsin's face did not diminish, but beneath the embarrassment, beneath the absurdity of it all, a fierce determination surfaced. It settled into her bones like iron filings finding a magnet. He was dying, and she could help. Fine, Tamsin said. I'll do it. That evening, she crossed into the king's private wing for the first time, escorted by a guard who maintained a diplomatic silence about the riverkeeper being led to the king's chambers after dark. The room was enormous. High ceilings, heavy drapes, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and the ever-present smell of him that she had been cataloging without realizing it since the creek. Pine and iron and a warmth beneath that she couldn't place. Calder was seated at a writing desk near the window, his jacket discarded over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He glanced up when she entered, and for one unguarded moment, the relief on his face was so naked it hurt to look at. He masked it immediately. The chair by the fire, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Tamsin settled into the chair, which was significantly more comfortable than the one in his study, and took out the river surveys she'd brought to work through. The fire crackled. The king's pen scratched against parchment. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable, like a shared blanket. An hour passed. She caught him testing his hearing again, tilting his head toward the corridor, and the small, involuntary exhale of relief when the sounds reached him made her throat tighten. He could hear the guards. He could hear the wind. He could hear the world again, because she was in the room. 2 hours passed. His pen slowed. His writing grew more fluid, less labored. He looked up from his work more often, not at her exactly, but toward her, his gaze landing near her shoulder before pulling back to the page, like he was reassuring himself she was still there. Late into the evening, Tamsin set down her surveys. The river at Ashenmere is going to need reinforcement before autumn, she said. The bank collapse was only the beginning. If we get another heavy rain season, the whole lower stretch will shift. The king said nothing for a long moment. Then, without looking up, "What would you need?" "Stone," she said. "Labor. Permission to redirect the Western Fork temporarily." She hesitated. "And someone who actually listens to the riverkeeper when she says the tributaries are mapped wrong." His pen stilled. He looked at her fully, and this time he didn't look away. "I'm listening," he said. The warmth in his voice was barely perceptible. Another person might have missed it entirely. But Tamsin heard it the way she heard the shift in a current before the water turned, subtle and unmistakable, and impossible to unhear once you'd noticed it. She talked about the rivers. He listened. And for the first time since the creek, the strangeness of the arrangement faded into a rhythm that almost felt natural. It was nearly midnight when she gathered her things to leave. She stood, stretched the stiffness from her back, and moved toward the door. "Wait." His voice stopped her mid-step. She turned. Calder stood at the far wall, silhouetted against the moonlight, his shoulders a rigid line. The relaxation that had built through the evening was draining out of him visibly, like water through cupped hands. His jaw was tight. His hands gripped the windowsill. "Stay," he said. "Tonight." The word cracked at its edges. He swallowed hard, and she watched the effort it took for him to force out the next sentence. "The wolf fades faster at night. When I'm alone. It—" He stopped, breathed. "It goes quiet. Completely quiet. And each time it takes longer to come back." Tamsin looked at the chair by the fire. "I'll stay." He shook his head slowly. "Not the chair. It has to be closer." Vedra said proximity determines the strength of the effect. Her pulse kicked hard against her throat. "How close?" He didn't answer. But the look in his eyes, ashamed and terrified of what he was asking, and even more terrified of what would happen if he didn't ask, told her everything she needed to know. Tamsin had imagined several versions of what sleeping in the Alpha King's chambers might look like. In none of them had she pictured herself standing at the foot of his bed in a borrowed nightgown, clutching a pillow against her sternum like a shield, while the most powerful man in Dunverin sat on the edge of the mattress and refused to look at her. "Vedra suggested the left side," Tamsin offered. "Vedra can suggest whatever she likes from the comfort of her own quarters," Calder replied, his voice clipped. "She also said that the closer the proximity, the stronger the effect on your—" "I'm aware of what she said." Silence. The fire cracked and popped. Tamsin shifted her weight from one foot to the other and tried to think of a useful contribution to this excruciating moment. Nothing came. "I can sleep on top of the covers," she suggested. "Fully dressed. With the pillow between us. Like a very uncomfortable wall." He looked at her then. The expression on his face was so conflicted, so tangled between relief and shame and a third emotion she wasn't ready to name, that her heart stumbled at the sight of it. "This is not appropriate," he said. "Neither is dying," Tamsin replied. His jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He lay back on the bed, still in his shirt and trousers, and stared at the ceiling with the rigid posture of a man preparing for battle. Tamsin placed the pillow in the center of the mattress, a barrier so laughably inadequate it barely qualified as symbolic, and lay down on her side with her back to him. The bed was absurdly large. She could have fit her entire cottage bedroom in the space between them. And yet, she was acutely, painfully aware of every inch of him, the warmth radiating from his body, the sound of his breathing, deliberate and controlled, the subtle shift of the mattress every time he moved. She couldn't hear his wolf. She had never been able to hear anyone's wolf, being what she was. Wolfless. Broken in the one way that mattered most in their world. But she could feel a faint hum in the air between them, like standing near a beehive on a warm afternoon. It was stronger here, closer, more alive than it had ever been in the study or the chair by the fire. Minutes passed. She felt the moment his body began to relax. The controlled breathing loosened into a slower, deeper rhythm. The tension bled out of his shoulders. "The river at Coppervein," he said into the dark. "What about it?" "You said the fork floods the barley fields every spring. How many years has it been doing that?" "6, at least. Probably longer. The old riverkeeper's records are a mess." "And no one fixed it?" "No one listened when I told them it needed fixing." A pause. "I would have listened." Tamsin's throat tightened. She stared at the dark shape of the curtains and tried to swallow around the sudden lump. "You're listening now," she said quietly. "You are remarkably easy to listen to," he replied, and his voice was so low she almost missed it. "Even when you're complaining about drainage budgets, which you do. Frequently." "I do not complain frequently. You told me yesterday that the steward's office had, and I quote, the hydrological awareness of a boiled turnip." That was an observation, not a complaint. A sound escaped him, brief, quiet, and unmistakably a laugh. Tamsin turned her head on the pillow, startled, but he had already gone quiet. The silence that followed was warm, though. Warm and close and humming with something that felt like the beginning of a conversation neither of them was ready to have out loud. Then his hand found hers across the pillow barrier. His fingers laced through hers, calloused and steady, and the hum between them swelled into a resonance she could feel in her bones. He fell asleep holding her hand. She felt it happen, the gradual surrender of his grip as consciousness released him, the deepening of his breath into a rhythm that was peaceful and unguarded. She lay there in the dark, her heart beating too fast, his hand slack and warm in hers, and tried to convince herself this was medical. She was failing at that when the hum changed. It started as a vibration in her palm where their skin touched, then spread up her arm, through her ribs, behind her eyes. The room dimmed. The fire faded. The warmth of the bed dissolved into cold. Tamsin opened her eyes and she was somewhere else. A forest. But wrong. The trees were enormous, ancient things, their bark black as charcoal, their branches bare and motionless against a sky that held no stars. No wind. No sound. Not the absence of noise, but the active presence of silence, a living thing that pressed against her ears like water. She was standing in a clearing. The ground beneath her feet was soft and gray, covered in ash. "Hello?" she called out. Her voice died 2 feet from her mouth. And then she saw it. A wolf. Massive, dark-furred, lying on its side in the center of the clearing. Its ribs were visible beneath matted fur. Its breathing was shallow and labored, each exhale sending a small puff of ash into the still air. Chains, not metal, but woven from shadow itself, wound around its legs and throat, anchoring it to the dead ground. The wolf opened one eye. It was pale gray. She knew that eye. "Calder," she breathed. The wolf's ear twitched. A low, broken sound escaped its throat. Not a growl, not a whimper, but a noise between the two that conveyed a grief so profound it buckled her knees. Tamsin reached for the chains. The moment her fingers touched them, pain lanced up her arm like fire and the forest fractured. She gasped awake. She was back in the bed, back in the king's chambers, her hand still locked in his. Her skin was ice cold. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Beside her, Calder slept on, his face peaceful, his breathing deep and even. He had no idea where she'd just been. Tamsin stared at the ceiling, her pulse roaring, her mind racing, her fingers still tingling where they'd touched those chains. That wasn't a dream. Dreams didn't leave ash between your fingers. She lifted her free hand and looked at it in the dying firelight. Gray dust, fine as powder, clung to her fingertips. Vedra did not take the news well. "You went inside him?" the healer repeated. her voice pitched low but sharp enough to cut glass. She had stopped grinding herbs mid-stroke, her pestle suspended over the mortar, her knuckles white. "I didn't choose to go," Tamsin said. "I was holding his hand, and then I was just there, in this dead forest, with his wolf." She swallowed. "Vedra, his wolf is chained, bound to the ground with ropes of shadow. It's dying in there." The healer set the pestle down slowly. "Describe the chains." "Dark, like woven shadow. When I touched them, it hurt. Burning pain up my whole arm, and when I woke up, there was ash on my fingers." Vedra's face had gone pale. "You brought material back from the wolf plane. Is that bad?" "That should not be possible," Vedra said, ignoring the question entirely. "You are wolfless. You have no astral tether, no spiritual anchor to the wolf plane. You should not be able to enter another wolf's inner landscape any more than a stone should be able to swim." "And yet?" Tamsin said. Vedra gave her a look that mixed grudging respect with genuine alarm. "And yet?" The healer crossed to her bookshelves and pulled down a volume so old its spine cracked when she opened it. She read in silence for several minutes, while Tamsin sat on the stool and tried not to vibrate out of her skin with anxiety. "The curse," Vedra murmured, half to herself. "After the Grey Peak campaign, Mora, the elder of the defeated pack, she cursed him before she died." "What did she say?" "Theron was there. He said the exact words were, 'You severed our pack's soul. Now watch your own be severed from you.'" Vedra traced a passage in the book with her finger. "A soul-severing curse. It's designed to separate an alpha from his wolf slowly, painfully, until the bond between man and beast breaks completely. Once it breaks, he dies," Tamsin finished. "He dies," Vedra confirmed. "But the curse should have run its course months ago. The fact that he's still alive suggests an interference. A force feeding his wolf just enough strength to keep holding on." Their eyes met. The answer was obvious. "Me," Tamsin said. Vedra nodded slowly. "And now you've crossed into the plane where the curse lives. Which means the curse knows you're there." A chill crawled down Tamsin's spine. "What does that mean?" Before Vedra could answer, the door to the workroom swung open. Calder filled the frame, and the look on his face stopped Tamsin's heart. He wasn't angry. He was terrified. "Vedra told me you entered the wolf plane," he said, his voice low and deadly calm in the way that calm was deadly when it preceded a storm. "She told me what you saw." Tamsin stood. "Your Majesty, I didn't mean to. The silence is not a place for you." He stepped inside, and the room shrank around him. "It is a prison. My prison. The curse built it to hold me, to break me, and now you've walked into it and it knows your face." "I touched the chains," Tamsin said. "Around your wolf. I was trying to help." A crack ran through his composure. For one unguarded second, she saw the full depth of his fear, not for himself, but for her. And it was bottomless. "You will not go back," he said. "You will not sleep in my chambers. You will not sit in my study. The arrangement is finished." The words hit her like a wall of cold water. "What?" "No. Calder, your wolf needs—" "My wolf is not worth your life." His voice broke on the last word. The composure shattered, and what was left beneath it was haggard and frightened, and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "Do you understand? I would rather lose the wolf. I would rather lose everything than drag you into that place and watch it take you, too." Tamsin reached for his arm. He stepped back like her touch would burn him. "Go back to your cottage," he said, and his voice had gone quiet again, controlled, the mask sliding back into place even as the cracks still showed through. "Go back to the rivers. Forget the arrangement. Forget." He stopped, swallowed. "Forget all of this." He turned and walked out. Tamsin stood in Vedra's workroom, her hand still outstretched, a fissure opening behind her ribs. She heard his footsteps recede down the corridor until there was nothing left but silence. The days that followed were the worst of Tamsin's life. She returned to her cottage by the creek. She returned to her surveys and her overflow channels, and her solitary walks along waterways that suddenly felt like the loneliest places in the world. The absence of him was physical. It started as a dull ache behind her sternum the first morning, a heaviness she attributed to sadness. By the second day, the pain had teeth. By the third, she couldn't eat without nausea. By the fourth, the migraines began, vicious and blinding, driving her to her knees in the middle of the Copper Vein Trail. She curled up on the bank of the creek where he'd found her, and pressed her forehead against the cool mud and tried to breathe through the agony. Her body was punishing her for the distance. Every cell she owned seemed to be reaching toward the palace, toward him, and the stretching hurt in ways she didn't have words for. She caught glimpses of him once, twice. His tall frame crossing the upper courtyard as she delivered a report to the steward's office. She had looked up and seen him, and the relief had been so sharp and sweet it nearly brought her to her knees, but he hadn't looked back, hadn't acknowledged her, had walked past like she was a stranger, and the knife of it buried itself so deep she couldn't find the handle. On the sixth night she tried to sleep and couldn't. The cottage was too quiet, too empty, too wrong without the sound of his breathing. She lay in the dark and felt the hum between them, distant now, faint, flickering like a candle in a draught. It was weaker than it had been a week ago. Whatever connected them was fraying. On the seventh day, she collapsed. Not dramatically, not publicly. She simply stood up from her desk in the riverkeeper's office, and the world tilted sideways, and the floor came up to meet her, and everything went gray. She woke to Vedra's face above her, drawn and furious. "How long have you been hiding this?" the healer demanded. Tamsin blinked against the harsh light of the infirmary. Her body felt like it had been hollowed out and filled with sand. Hiding what? The migraines, the nausea, the fact that you can barely stand. Vedra pressed her fingers to Tamsin's wrist, checking her pulse, and her mouth thinned into a hard line. "You are deteriorating, rapidly. I'm fine. I just need to eat. You need to listen." Vedra leaned in close. "You and the king share a forming bond, an incomplete mating bond. It's been building since the creek, maybe since before the creek, and his rejection of the arrangement didn't sever it. It's still pulling, still growing, and the distance between you is tearing it apart." Tamsin stared at her. The word bond echoed through her like a struck bell. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I'm wolfless. Wolfless omegas don't form bonds. We can't. We don't have—" "I know what the textbooks say," Vedra interrupted. "And I know what my instruments are telling me. Your vitals are mirroring his. When he declines, you decline. Your pain follows his pain. Your weakness follows his weakness." She paused, letting the weight of the next word settle. "If his wolf dies, he dies. And because of the bond forming between you, incomplete as it is, you will follow him." The infirmary ceiling blurred. Tamsin blinked, and tears she hadn't felt building spilled down her temples into her hair. "Does he know?" she asked. Vedra straightened. "No. And I suspect if he did, he'd do something spectacularly self-destructive to try to break the bond and save you." "That sounds exactly like what he'd do," Tamsin said through her teeth. "Which is why," Vedra said, meeting her eyes, "you need to decide what you're going to do about it before he finds out." Tamsin decided in the time it took to sit up in the infirmary bed. "I'm going back to him," she said. "He'll refuse you," Vedra warned. "Then I'll refuse to be refused." Vedra's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "You're as stubborn as he is." "Worse," Tamsin said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The room swam briefly, then steadied. I've been maintaining Dunvarin's waterways for 6 years. I've argued with floodwaters, frozen rivers, and a bureaucracy that doesn't believe in preventative maintenance. One Alpha King is not going to be the thing that stops me. She found Theron in his office, a small room off the main corridor that was immaculately organized in a way that revealed everything about the man who occupied it. Maps pinned with mathematical precision, reports stacked in order of priority, a single cup of cold tea that suggested he'd been too busy to drink it. "My lord," Tamsin started. "I was about to send for you," Theron said, looking up from his desk. His expression was carefully controlled, but weariness lived in his eyes, deeper than lack of sleep. "He's worse, isn't he?" Tamsin asked. Theron didn't need to answer. The slight tightening around his mouth was enough. "His wolf has gone completely silent," Theron said. 3 days now. His hearing is gone. His night vision is gone. Yesterday, he tried to grip a sword during training, and his hand wouldn't close. The deterioration is accelerating beyond anything Vedra predicted. A pause. "He's running out of time, Miss Coraith." "Then get me back inside his chambers." Theron studied her. "He gave explicit orders. No one is to admit you to the upper corridors." "I don't care about his orders." "I gathered that." The ghost of a smile crossed Theron's face. "As it happens, neither do I. Not when they're killing him." He rose from his desk. "I'll take you tonight, after the palace settles." "Theron," Tamsin said, stopping him at the door. "He'll be furious with you." "The king can be furious with me from a position of being alive," Theron replied. "I've made my peace with it." That night, long after the corridors had gone quiet, Theron led her through the palace in silence. Their footsteps whispered against stone. The upper wing was dark and still, the sconces burned low, the shadows deep and watchful. Theron stopped at the king's door. He looked at her for a long moment, then opened the door and stepped aside. The chambers were dark. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in deep amber and shadow. Tamsin stepped inside and heard the latch click softly behind her. Calder was standing at the far end of the room, half turned toward the window, his hands braced against the writing desk. The moonlight carved him in silver and black. He turned at the sound. And even in the dimness, even across the width of the room, she saw the way his whole body reacted. The sharp intake of breath. The way his hands curled into fists, and his shoulders pulled back, and his chin dropped slightly as if a force inside him had lunged forward. His wolf. Faint. Failing, but responding. Reaching for her even from the edge of death. "Tamsin." Her name came out ragged. "You can't be here. And you can't keep sending me away." She moved toward him, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. "I know about the bond, Calder." He went still, completely, terribly still. "Vedra told me," she continued, stopping 3 feet away. Close enough to feel the pull between them, the invisible current that ran from her ribs to his. "I know that what's happening to you is happening to me. I know that if your wolf dies, I follow. And I know you would rather rip yourself apart than let that happen, because that is exactly the kind of noble, infuriating, self-destructive thing you would do." His breathing was unsteady. His fists were trembling. "You should run," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever is between us, you should run from it. Find a healer who can sever it before—" "No." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. "I have spent my entire life being told I am incomplete," Tamsin said, and her voice shook, but she didn't stop. Every healer, every elder, every pitying look from every wolf who could feel theirs and knew I couldn't. Wolfless, broken, less than. She took another step closer. "And then you found me in a creek, covered in mud, stuck in the earth like something discarded, and you looked at me like I was the most important thing you'd ever seen." His eyes were bright. She could see moisture catching the moonlight. "I am not running from you," she said. "Not from the bond. Not from the curse. Not from the silence or the chains or whatever is killing your wolf. I am the only person in this kingdom who makes your wolf fight to stay alive, and you want me to leave?" "I want you to live," he said, and the words broke on the way out. "Then let me stay." She closed the distance between them. Her hand found his heart slamming against her palm. "Because I am not living. Not without this. Not without you." His control shattered. His hands came up and cradled her face, tilting it toward him, and the sound he made was wounded and grateful and wrecked. "I can hear your heartbeat," he whispered, his forehead pressed against hers. "Right now, standing here, I can hear it. I can smell the creek water in your hair. I can feel the floor beneath my feet, every grain of the stone. You bring everything back. Everything. And when you leave, the silence is so much worse because I remember what it's like to be whole." Tamsin kissed him. She rose onto her toes and pressed her mouth against his, and the bond between them detonated. She felt it surge, a wave of heat and light and belonging that started behind her ribs and spread outward until her entire body was humming with it. He made a sound against her lips, half breath, half growl, and his arms wrapped around her and pulled her in so tightly there was no space left between them. "If you stay," he said between kisses, each word a surrender, "I won't be able to let you go again." "Good," she breathed. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her so tightly that the bond between them flared like a struck match. She felt the warmth spread outward from where their hearts pressed together, golden and bright and growing stronger with every second of contact. His wolf surged. She felt it through the bond, felt the creature inside him lunge toward the surface with a force that shook them both. Calder pressed his forehead to hers, breathing hard, and the bond wove itself tighter with every shared breath, every whispered word, every moment they refused to let go. Then he marked her. The mating bite, placed gently at the curve of her neck, instinctive and claiming. The bond locked into place with a force that stole her breath, a golden thread connecting them in a way that went beyond touch, beyond language, beyond anything she had imagined possible. She marked him back, sealing the bond from her side, and felt it blaze to completion between them. She could feel him now, not just his presence beside her, but him, his relief, his joy, his wolf, howling inside him for the first time in over a year, wild and alive and fiercely grateful. They held each other for a long time, learning the shape of the bond, the warmth of it, the way it hummed between them like a living thing. And when exhaustion finally claimed them, Calder pulled her against his chest and held her with the fierce, absolute grip of a man who had nearly lost everything and couldn't quite believe it had been returned. His wolf was alive, alive and present and burning steady behind his ribs. She could feel it through the bond, a warm pulse that matched his heartbeat. Tamsin closed her eyes. The ache that had lived in her body for weeks was gone. In its place was warmth, connection, a rightness that ran so deep she wanted to weep. She let sleep take her, safe in his arms, the bond humming golden between them. She woke in darkness, but not his darkness, not the warm, fire-lit dark of his chambers. Cold. Silence. The smell of ash. Tamsin opened her eyes and the dead forest stretched endlessly before her. The black trees, the starless sky, the crushing, suffocating absence of sound. And ahead of her, at the center of the clearing, his wolf lay chained to the ground. Its gray eyes were open, watching her. But this time, it was not alone. A presence stood behind it in the shadows between the trees, a figure that had not been there before. It turned its ancient, terrible attention toward her and smiled. The curse had a face. It stood behind the chained wolf like a shadow given permission to exist, tall and thin and shaped like a woman, but wrong in every proportion. Its limbs were too long, its fingers too sharp, its mouth too wide, and when it smiled at Tamsin, the expression held no warmth, only the patient satisfaction of a trap that had finally been sprung. "There you are," it said. The voice was layered, a dozen voices speaking in unison, some weeping, some whispering, all of them threaded with a grief so vast it pressed against Tamsin like a physical weight. "I wondered when you'd come back." Tamsin's legs shook beneath her, but she held her ground. The ash was cold under her bare feet. The dead trees loomed overhead, skeletal and watching. "What are you?" she demanded. "I am what he earned," the curse replied. "I am the debt he refuses to pay. I am every soul he severed from its wolf when he burned the gray peak to the ground." The chained wolf whimpered. The sound was barely audible, a fading thing, and it cut through Tamsin like a blade. She stepped toward it, but the curse raised one elongated hand and the air thickened around her, holding her in place. "You cannot free what he will not release," the curse said. "He holds these chains tighter than I do." "That's a lie," Tamsin said through her teeth. "Is it?" The clearing shifted. The dead trees blurred and reformed, and suddenly Tamsin was standing in a different place entirely. A battlefield. Smoke hung low over scorched earth. The fallen lay across the ground, wolves and humans alike, the terrible aftermath of a conflict that had spared no one. And in the center of it, Calder knelt. Not the Calder she knew, broad and commanding and alive with the fierce intelligence that had drawn her in from that first day at the creek. This was a diminished version, stripped of armor, stripped of authority, stripped of everything except unprocessed guilt. His head was bowed. His hands were open on his thighs, palms up, as if waiting for judgment. Figures surrounded him. Ghosts, translucent and flickering, their faces drawn with accusation. Gray Peak wolves, men and women and the young, all watching the king with eyes that held no forgiveness. One figure stood closer than the rest. A boy, barely old enough to be called a man, with a wound that would never heal. His hands were raised, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender that had come too late. "Orin," Calder whispered, and the name cracked in his mouth like dry wood. Tamsin felt the guilt through the bond. It hit her like a wall of black water, so dense she nearly drowned in it. He hadn't just fought the Grey Peak. He had ordered the final assault. He had given the command that ended the war, and in the chaos of that ending, a boy with his hands raised had fallen before anyone could stop it. "I gave the order to cease," Calder said to the ghost, his voice hollow. "I gave the order, but it was too late. You were already falling." The ghost of Orin tilted his head. When he spoke, the words came in Calder's own voice, turned back against him like a mirror. A better king would have been faster. A better alpha would have seen one boy among the chaos. You failed. You always fail. And so you deserve to lose what they lost. "No," Tamsin said. The word rang through the silence like a bell, cutting through the layered whispers of the dead. The ghosts turned toward her. The curse turned toward her. Even Calder lifted his head, his gray eyes finding hers across the ruined battlefield. She walked toward him. The guilt pressed against her like a current, but she pushed through it, step by step, until she was kneeling in front of him on the scorched ground. "You believe you deserve this," she said, her voice shaking. "You believe that because you gave an order in a war you didn't start, because a boy died in chaos you couldn't control, you deserve to have your soul torn out of you. That's what the curse feeds on, not magic. Your agreement." "He was 17, Calder whispered. He had his hands up. "And you gave the order to stop." Tamsin gripped his hands, forcing them closed around hers. "You were the one who tried. You were the one who offered peace first, who negotiated, who exhausted every option before blood was spilled. The Grey Peak Alpha refused, not you. You did not fail that boy. War failed him. And you have been punishing yourself ever since, because punishing yourself is easier than accepting that some things cannot be prevented. Tears tracked down his face. The ghosts murmured, "I know what it feels like to believe you are fundamentally broken," Tamsin continued, and now her own voice cracked. "I have lived my entire life without a wolf. Every shifter I have ever known has looked at me and seen something incomplete, something missing. And I believed them. For 26 years, I believed I was less than whole." She squeezed his hands tighter. "But I was wrong. And so are you. You are not defined by the worst moment of the worst day of a war you tried to prevent. You are defined by the fact that even now, even here, chained to your own guilt, your wolf is still fighting to stay alive because it knows you are worth staying for." The battlefield flickered. The ghosts wavered. "Let him go," Tamsin said, looking at Oren's ghost. "Let them all go. Not because the grief doesn't matter, but because holding them here doesn't honor them. It just keeps everyone trapped." Calder's hands tightened around hers. She felt a shift move through the bond, a great grinding release, like a fault line surrendering pressure it had held for years. "I'm sorry," he said to the boy with the wound that would never heal. "I'm sorry I wasn't fast enough. I will carry that for the rest of my life. But I cannot stay here with you anymore." The ghost of Oren looked at the king for a long, still moment. Then the boy lowered his surrendering hands. His expression softened, and he dissolved into the gray like smoke into open sky. One by one, the others followed. The battlefield faded. The dead trees thinned. The suffocating silence began to loosen its grip. But the curse remained. It stood at the edge of the clearing, diminished now but not gone, its too wide smile tightening into a grimace. The chains around the wolf were looser but still holding, still anchored. "The guilt feeds me," the curse hissed, "but the chains were forged with blood. Grief alone cannot break them." Tamsin looked at the chains, looked at the wolf, its gray eyes open, watching her with more intelligence, more awareness, more life than it had held before. It was fighting, straining against the bonds, but it couldn't break free alone. A stirring rose inside her, deep, ancient. A vibration she had felt once before, in a creek bed, when a king's hand had closed around her arm. But now it was louder, closer, pressing against the inside of her ribs like a creature trying to be born. Her wolf, not absent, not broken, not missing, dormant, waiting, sleeping inside her since the day she was born, patient and quiet, biding its time for the one call powerful enough to wake it. Its mate's call. The chained wolf threw back its head and howled. The sound was wild and beautiful, and it reached inside Tamsin and found the presence that had been sleeping there her entire life, and pulled. The pain was blinding. Tamsin's back arched, her hands clenching in the ash, and she felt herself crack open. Not breaking, but blooming, a door flung wide after decades sealed shut. Heat poured through her, golden and fierce, and when she opened her eyes, she was no longer kneeling. She was standing on 4 legs, silver fur, a body built for speed and endurance, compact and powerful. A wolf, her wolf. Alive and real and howling back at the chained wolf with a voice that shattered the dead silence of the clearing like glass. She lunged at the chains, her teeth closed around the shadow-woven bonds and tore. Pain seared through her jaw, but she didn't stop. Beside her, Calder's wolf surged to its feet, pulling, straining, the chains snapping one by one as 2 wolves fought in tandem against the darkness. The curse screamed. The sound was terrible, a layered shriek of grief and rage and dissolving power. The chains shattered. The dead forest cracked. The ash rose into the air like a storm. And then silence. Real silence. The peaceful, clean silence of a thing finally ending. Tamsin opened her eyes. The king's chambers. The warm amber light of a fire that had been stoked by someone who cared. Calder beside her, awake, staring at her with an expression of such profound wonder it rewrote every sad and lonely thing she had ever believed about herself. "Your wolf," he whispered, his hand coming up to cradle her face. "Tamsin, I felt your wolf." She was crying. She hadn't realized it until his thumb brushed the tears from her cheek. "I felt it too," she said, and laughed through the tears, a sound of disbelief and joy so tangled together she couldn't separate them. "I felt it." He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her so tightly she could feel his heartbeat everywhere, and through the bond she felt his wolf, unchained and howling and free, pressing against hers in recognition, in gratitude, in the certainty that they had found each other at last. The curse was broken. The silence was gone. And for the first time in her life, Tamsin was whole. The wolf did not come back all at once. Calder's senses returned gradually over the weeks that followed, each one arriving like a guest who had been away too long and needed time to settle in. His hearing sharpened first, then his night vision, then the preternatural reflexes that had made him a legend on the battlefield. His first full shift happened on a cold morning 3 weeks after the curse broke, and Tamsin stood in the courtyard and watched a massive dark wolf throw back its head and howl at a pale winter sky, and she wept with a joy she didn't bother hiding. Her own wolf was quieter, smaller. It surfaced in flashes, a sharpening of her senses, an instinct she'd never had before, the occasional overwhelming urge to run that she didn't always resist. She shifted in front of witnesses on the day of their formal mating ceremony, a silver wolf stepping delicately out of the skin of a river keeper, and the court's stunned silence was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. A wolfless omega mated to the alpha king had been scandalous enough. A wolf born from a mating bond, a phenomenon the oldest records barely referenced, was another matter entirely. The whispers didn't stop. They just changed direction. Tamsin didn't care. She had rivers to tend. It was autumn when she found herself back at Ashenmere Creek, surveying the new stone reinforcements along the eastern bank. The work was good, solid, funded by a king who had listened when she said the tributaries needed fixing. She was checking the overflow channels when the ground softened beneath her. "No," she said aloud. "Absolutely not. Not again." She sank to her knees in the mud, then her thighs. The creek, apparently, had a sense of humor. Hoofbeats on the bank above her. She looked up. Calder sat on his horse, silhouetted against the autumn sky, his mouth twitching with the effort of not laughing. "Don't you dare," Tamsin warned. He dismounted. He was grinning, a full, unguarded grin that still made her heart stumble every time she saw it, because it was so rare and so entirely hers. "The river keeper," he observed, "appears to be stuck. The river keeper is going to drown you in this creek if you don't stop smiling." He waded in, boots and all, and stood in front of her, knee-deep in water, the autumn light catching the silver in his eyes. He reached for her. His hand closed around her arm, warm and steady and sure. "I've got you," he said, and he pulled her free.